It just gives me great pleasure to introduce both Jane Morrice and Sir Graham Bishop. They're both very distinguished European civil servants, parliamentarians, representatives. Jane has been a former deputy head of the European Social Committee. She's also headed up the Commission office in Northern Ireland, I understand, and also a deputy speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly. So you've seen politics in Ireland, the north of Ireland and Europe from many different perspectives, as well as being deputy chair, I believe, of the Equalities Commission. So this is quite a multi-angle on the questions we're facing today. So I'm very, very grateful for your presence here today, Jane. And also Sir Graham Watson, who is also a distinguished Liberal Democrat, MEP, I believe, for well over a decade for the Southwest and Gibraltar, also on the European Social Committee, and I would say a very canny observer of British European politics and more. One of the few people I recall in 2016 publicly saying he thought Trump was going to win it, to a rather aghast audience here in Brussels. So good call there, Graham. Last point is that both of our speakers have been very firm friends of Pro-Europa and have not just talked the talk, but walked the walk. And they've been on demonstrations, platforms, and have spoken with us. I recall Jane, I think, outside UCREP once, at least once, having our voices heard. And Graham many times with us in the Remplace Schumann. So we're both very grateful for your not just talking the talk, but walking the walk with us. Anyway, enough from me, and it's over to Jane. And the topic for today is Whither Northern Ireland and Scotland, and perhaps Whither the United Kingdom. For a very interesting perspective, the floor is with Jane Morrice.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you very much to Pro-Europa for giving me this opportunity to put my rather interesting, creative proposal to you. But before I do, I want to give you a bit of my background. You've said a bit, and also set out my stall. So yes, I was a journalist working for the BBC I was born in Belfast. I worked for the BBC as a reporter in the 80s in Belfast. Then I worked as the European Commission's representative to Northern Ireland in the 90s. And when the ceasefires came, I was involved in helping to set up the European Peace Programme in Northern Ireland, which is the biggest and most unique peace programme ever operated by the European Union. And it is still going beyond Brexit, which is great. Then I got involved in politics, a women's party. Everyone said Northern Ireland would never be the first place in the world to elect women from a women's party, but they were wrong. So I was elected to the first Northern Ireland Assembly and became Deputy Speaker of the first Northern Ireland Assembly, representing the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. And then after that, the European Economic and Social Committee. I'm sure I've skipped somewhere in between, but yes, for 15 years represented Northern Ireland in the EESC, was Vice President for a while, Deputy Speaker, if you like. And of course, that all came to a very abrupt halt. Was it January last year now when we stopped? And I have to say, from well before the referendum 2016, I have been battling against Brexit the whole time, and obviously since the referendum doing the same. After the referendum, I put out a proposal for Northern Ireland it was a petition for Northern Ireland to stay in the EU as part of the UK. Yes, that's what the protocol became. It was a type of special status or honorary association, I called it, but that became the protocol. So my position on the protocol, on the whole issue, is I've always been against Brexit for the UK, but I'm accepting the protocol as the best of a bad Brexit deal. So on that, then, where do we go next? The biggest problem facing us here in Northern Ireland is, at the moment, unionist opposition to the protocol. And I believe now this would be something that I have to be careful to choose my words and being diplomatic, but I believe that a lot of unionism realizes the mistake that is Brexit and using the protocol as a scapegoat. When people try to say, the protocol is as a result of Brexit, the answer from them is this isn't the Brexit we wanted. When you ask what is the Brexit you want, I don't know whether there's a reply that is satisfactory for me anyway. But obviously that's the biggest difficulty is the protocol, and particularly the border in the Irish Sea, as they call it. I mean, even that jargon has become politicized because it's a customs border, etc. There's an awful lot I can say about that, but I won't, because I'm going to just go into the solution. I prefer to do that in our time. The idea is to extend the protocol to Scotland. And that would, and I'm going to set out it ticks every box in the book, I believe. And I'm going to set out the position both with regard to Scotland, Northern Ireland, London and Brussels, if I may. Here we go. I'll start from a Scottish perspective. It would satisfy by Scotland being in the protocol, or the same arrangements that Northern Ireland is getting extended to Scotland. That would satisfy, I believe, the pro-independent argument in Scotland, because it would be a waiting room. It would allow Scotland to be half in, half out, the way Northern Ireland is at the moment. So it would be a waiting room for eventual EU membership. It would also satisfy the anti-independent argument in that it could keep Scotland in the UK, because that is an argument used here in Northern Ireland. So that's both of those as far as the Scottish perspective. From a Northern Ireland perspective, obviously the most contested, controversial issue is that the Irish Sea border. But if that border was then moved away from the Irish Sea or the island of Ireland to Scotland and England, that absolutely takes the politics out of it in terms of this island. And I think that's a very important political thing, even if it's just discussed. It means that the Irish Sea border and the dilution of British identity, which is something that is being argued here, that we're being cut off from the rest of the UK. If Scotland is included, we're not being cut off. So that's that argument. And then I go to the London perspective. Again, that could satisfy London in that it keeps Northern Ireland and Scotland in the UK as part of the EU, exactly what Northern Ireland and Scotland wanted when we voted to remain in the EU. So another perfect box ticked. Perfect tick box. Then the next and last is Brussels, obviously. And this is probably undoubtedly the most important at the moment, because it would need their approval. So therefore it would need to be asked of them, 27 member states. But what it could do is it could put Brexit to bed at last. I mean, I think that is a hugely important one. If it worked, the Brexit debate is over. Secondly, it would encourage and hopefully restore and keep peace and stability in the island of Ireland. So that is that part that Brussels could understand would work for them for the 27th. But there's no doubt, and I've been talking to Brussels, lobbying there too, and there's no doubt that there's an awful lot of the 27 member states are saying, hold it a minute, we've had enough of this protocol. Come on, we don't want another, Scotland in. But if you look at it not necessarily as a protocol, if you look at it as just extending the arrangements, the trading and the customs union and the single market arrangements to Scotland, and look at the border, it's 100 miles Scotland, England, it's 300 miles Northern Ireland, Ireland, and so it's much, much easier to regulate. And of course, there's more goods going through, but it's still easier to regulate because there's 6 main national routes. So all of those arguments, I'm talking fast now because I know I must be coming close to my end. And I want to just say that, okay, my thinking about the extension of the protocol is sort of an extension of thinking that came from the Celtic, I don't know which way to pronounce it, association, which there's an academic in Dublin, Dorcha Lee, has been talking about this. And by the way, the first that I heard of it around about the debate of Brexit and the referendum was Skleeny. I think the problem with that was it wasn't a very nice name. That was Scotland, Ireland, and Northern Ireland coming together as a type of Benelux. Now, the Benelux were the first countries to set up, to the founding members of the European Union. So why could we not have a Northern Benelux, which is Scotland, Ireland, and Northern Ireland? And that would be the end result, and we'd all be back in together. And that's where I'm going to rest my case, if I may.
Thanks very much, Jane. That's a very provocative thesis, and I actually I'd love to chew more on that. But first off, we go to Graham for a perspective from Scotland and maybe a few quick thoughts. So over to Graham, and then we'll get Jane back to comment on Graham's review.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you for the invitation, and congratulations once again to Pro Europa on the way in which you are keeping going a hugely important debate about the future of the United Kingdom in the wake of the Brexit decision. Could I start by saying that I very much welcome Jane's initiative. I read the article that she published in The Independent about the proposal for a protocol. Jane has served for many, many years on the European Economic and Social Committee after a distinguished career in Northern Ireland. I served for only one term on the Economic and Social Committee after a career elsewhere. Well, I think in UK parlance, one would say in another place. But I had the great pleasure of working with Jane and appreciating the vibrancy of her mind and of the ideas that she brings forward. I think what she has done is not only drawn attention to the way in which Northern Ireland has suffered hugely from the decision by the Conservatives to put a border down the Irish Sea, but also drawn attention to the rather strange outcome that a United Kingdom government has chosen in a situation where 2 of the 4 component nations actually voted by fairly substantial majorities to remain within the European Union. I suspect that the troubles that we are seeing within the unionist parties in Northern Ireland at the moment stem directly from the mistake that they made in backing Brexit, and perhaps particularly from the mistake they made in trusting Boris Johnson, who has done something that Theresa May said she would not do, which was to put a border down the middle of the Irish Sea. And, you know, we're in this situation because a party in government, which still has the official title Conservative and Unionist Party, has actually decided to overrule the wishes of clear majorities in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and actually started to do things that are breaking up the union. I'm not sure if anyone on this in this conference read the excellent interview carried out by John Lloyd and published in the Financial Times last weekend, an interview with Sir Tom Devine, who is Scotland's leading historian. One of the things that Tom Devine said, and I think is felt by many of us, is that we almost feel as if England is pushing Scotland out of the Union. I was a candidate in the recent elections that took place here for the Holyrood Parliament. I have to tell you, I was a candidate in a seat where I had absolutely no danger of being elected. but nonetheless, I wanted to be part of the action. And there was very much this feeling within the campaign. And when we look at Whither, Scotland, we have to go back to the 2014 referendum on independence. In that referendum, I remind you, there was a clear majority, 55% against Scottish independence. And that would probably still be the case today had it not been for the European Union referendum 2 years later, when Scotland voted to stay and England voted against. And what we've seen since then is a move of Remainers, a move of certain Unionists towards independence. We have seen a shrinking of the middle ground. I can tell you there is almost no middle ground in Scotland at the moment. Since 2017, the opinion polls have shown about 50-50 for independence, and the election results on the 6th of May confirm that. 49% of the constituency vote went to parties supporting independence, the SNP and the Greens. 50.1% of the list vote went to parties against independence, the Conservatives, Labour and the Liberal Democrats. There is evidence of tactical voting among unionist parties to keep the SNP out in certain seats. And there's evidence of tactical voting between the SNP and the Greens to keep the unionist parties out in certain seats. But the SNP won their majority. They're one short of an overall majority. They claim a mandate for a second independence referendum. The government at Westminster, the Prime Minister says, no, a referendum is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. But Michael Gove has to say, yes, this is a voluntary union. The Scotland Act reserves the right to decide on whether a referendum can be held to Westminster. All parties currently agree that the time is not right because of the problems created by COVID, but all of them expect a move within 5 years by the SNP to try to seek a legal solution for a referendum. And Nicola Sturgeon has said very clearly, we are not going down the Catalonia route. Anything we do must be recognized internationally. Now, my perspective, my view is that there is no guarantee that the SNP would win a referendum. There is no clear majority for independence. And probably their biggest failure in terms of convincing people has been the economic arguments. Brexit has, in a sense, made independence less likely because it is clear that any vote for independence would be a vote for a hard border between Scotland and England. And this is where I think I slightly part company with Jane on the idea of a protocol. I don't think Scotland would vote for a hard border. The protocol follows the logic of Boris Johnson's decision to create a hard border down the Irish Sea, and it would follow the logic of a majority in Scotland and Northern Ireland having voted to stay within the customs union and the single market. It doesn't really deal with the logic of trade volumes across the border between Scotland and England, which are very, very much more substantial than the trade volumes across the border in Ireland. I mean, you have a situation in Northern Ireland where about 33% of goods exports go to the Republic, travel south, and about 1.5% of the Republic's exports of goods travel back north. You have a total trade worth something like £4 billion involving about 100 companies. And while it's true that the Republic is Northern Ireland's largest export destination, that's partly because sales to the rest of the United Kingdom are not considered as exports, they're not classed as exports. If you look at Scotland, the situation is very different. Scotland exports £81 billion worth of goods every year, and 51 billion of those go to the rest of the UK. There is a similar flow in the other direction, but there are 4 times as many goods exported within or across the border as exported to the rest of the European Union. We're talking about massive numbers of movements of freight, mainly by HGVs across the border, not just on the M74 or the M6 in England, but on the A1, the A7, the A68, and so on and so forth. Even if you look at the rest of Scotland's goods exports, the statistics tell you most of them go to the Netherlands. That's the Rotterdam effect. But the reality is very few or very little of Scotland's trade really is with the rest of the world. If you look at the way in which Scotland trades with the EU, 2/3 is in goods and 1/3 is in services. But actually, that is tiny compared to Scotland's trade with England and the rest of the UK, and even these days with the export of goods to China or Germany or Korea. Services accounts for 75% of Scotland's economy, only about 1/3 of its external trade. There are huge difficulties already as a result of Brexit. These are getting worse. The new rules, the new VAT rules for e-commerce are going to make them worse. But things would be at least twice as bad and possibly more if we were to combine a hard border with the disadvantages of Brexit that have already come up. Where will we go? Well, that's to be seen. My view is let us try to get the whole of the United Kingdom back into the European Union. Let us hope that Boris Johnson will be cast aside in the way that Donald Trump was, and we can go back to business as usual. If that fails, then I suspect there will be a clear majority for independence in Scotland in 5 or 10 years' time.
Jane, a quick reflection on what you've just heard from Graham, and then we'll open up the questions.
First of all, thank you very much to Sir Graham. I had a wonderful time, albeit relatively short, when he was in the ESC as a sparring partner to debate these things. And I would like to say his precision on points and the value that he puts on knowing the details is pretty spectacular, and he's got a great reputation for it. And thank you. And that's what you have done in your contribution there. Whereas I tend to look at the politics rather than the precision or even the pragmatism. So all of your detail about obviously the trade, the difference between trade north-south of Ireland and north-south of England, Scotland is obviously terribly important. But don't forget, it's only 100 miles, only 6 main roads, so it can easily regulate it. I won't use the word policed. And also a hugely important thing about this is the fact that the border between England and Scotland is not as controversial as has been in Ireland. And there isn't a history of what has been happening in Northern Ireland. So that is a huge difference in terms of the politics of that. But I did like, and I've only got a minute, I did like Graham's conclusion, which is, 4 or 5 years, I think he said, that, if things don't change and I'll take a point that was said in somebody, I won't call it London because London voted in, so I call it Westminster. But if things don't change radically within 4 or 5 years, we're looking at a hugely changing face of the United Kingdom. And I think that's something that people have got to be aware of. People have got to, and so therefore, if something like the extension of Scotland coming into the same arrangements as Northern Ireland, surely that is the perfect solution. But I'll make a plea as a final point. I need your help, because I need the voices to get out there in Scotland in particular. I need people to start asking for this, and therefore Brussels will find it more difficult to refuse. So I want to talk to Dublin, Edinburgh, London, Westminster, wherever, and I need help to make this happen, and I believe it will be good for everyone. Thank you.
Many thanks for that, Jane. We've got some questions coming in. Hector, can you fill it out?
Yes, Owen Gardner has a question about Wales. I'll read it out. So given Sir Graham's comments, is the solution, Ray, trade volumes across the Irish Sea to include Wales in the proposed protocol too, especially given that the Senate is now in receipt of a majority of pro-EU parties following the elections a fortnight ago?
Responses I'm getting quite a lot when I put this idea out there is, what about Wales? What about the Isle of Man? What about et cetera, et cetera? And I suppose the response at the time back when I originally put it out is that obviously Wales voted for Brexit. So it would be difficult to persuade that one, but I think things are changing in Wales, and I'm not as closely aware of what's going on now. But it is right that when people read this, they all say to me, "What about Wales?" So why not? Why not is my answer.
I think I would add, if I may, Chairman, that there's much that can be done to increase solidarity and to increase trade between the Celtic nations. I'm not somebody who agrees with very much of what Boris Johnson says, but on the basis that even a broken clock is right twice a day, I would say that I think his idea of a bridge between Scotland and Northern Ireland is an excellent one. I think it would do for trade between Northern Ireland and Scotland what the bridge between Denmark and Sweden has done. I think it would be hugely beneficial for the movement of people and to some extent for the movement of freight, and we should do it. But I think that, and this is to put a political hat on, I think that honestly, those of us who think that Brexit was a disaster should not fall into the trap of allowing the United Kingdom to be broken up, because the biggest chance that we have is keeping the UK together and getting it back in one way or another into the European Union.
Jane, I know that from your back window, the bridge might actually be built outside your window.
That's absolutely right. There is a proposal. This is Ballyholme near Bangor, 15 miles from Belfast. You can look over the sea and you can see Scotland. And in fact, I could even see the windmills on the hills in Scotland yesterday. But you can't see a thing because it was a very bad weather today. But yes, the bridge is definitely a very interesting debate. And the talk was coming into Donaghadee just behind me here. But rather than that, it's about going into Larne north would be something more interesting, perhaps. And then, of course, there's the roundabout under the Isle of Man. Isn't that another one that is being talked about? I think this division, the point that Graham made there about not wanting the breakup of the United Kingdom, again, I will argue that this idea to bring Scotland into the protocol, to have a type of Celtic protocol, could help the UK to stay together, because Northern Ireland and Scotland would be content with their lot then, because we would have, and we'd have, the best of all worlds. Scottish whiskey can get from wherever in through Northern Ireland and Ireland into the 400 million consumers, and Scottish fish and everything under the protocol. So that could serve the purpose of keeping Scotland and Northern Ireland in the UK. Now, there's many people who would not want that, obviously. And that's another point that Graham makes, which has pointed it out to me easily. This 50-50 seems to be the politics of the day, whether it's pro or anti-Brexit in the UK, whether it's pro or anti-independent in Scotland, whether it's pro or anti-United Ireland in Northern Ireland. There's a 50-50 all the way. So we've got to learn how to accommodate both, because one cannot override the other anymore. So I suppose this, as a Scotland in the protocol, a type of Celtic association in the European Union, with Scotland and Northern Ireland staying in the UK. Is it not too perfect, too good to be true?
Yes.
Surely having such a debate that's so controversial would actually bring the debate forward about keeping the UK together. So maybe it's a good thing to promote this subject. And I think maybe it is. What do you think, Sir Graham?
As I said, John, in my opening remarks, I think one of the delights of working with Jane is that she's coming up with provocative ideas all the time, and provocative ideas are essential for what we're doing. Yes, so I mean, I'm top marks to Jane. I was very interested to read what she was saying. I think it would be hugely damaging to Scotland at the moment, but you know, let's talk about the idea. Somebody mentioned whiskey and food exports. Look, despite what whiskey did to my pancreas, I'm very much in favor of the whiskey industry doing well. But I would say this, whiskey and food and drink exports are worth about 10 billion to Scotland. Our total exports are over 80 billion. So keep things in perspective. We're talking about perhaps 12.5% of trade. It's important. But it's by no means everything. I think my view remains that the chances of ousting people who I would consider to be a bunch of charlatans currently running the United Kingdom within a reasonable period are not bad. I think there may just be a chance of getting the United Kingdom back into the European Union within a period of 15 to 20 years. And that would be my first preference. But I don't think that time is on our side, at least if your perspective and your prejudices are the same as mine, on this issue. Because I think the longer that things go on, the more difficult it gets, the greater will become the pressures for a breakup of the United Kingdom. And maybe Jane actually has a kernel of an idea here, that we might go back to something like the Kingdom of Alba of the 8th and the 9th century, where Scotland and the island of Ireland are united under one authority, and perhaps part of the European Union as one unit, who knows?
There's a question here from Jez Thomas.
Basically, if the Good Friday Agreement is to be respected, as I understand it, that cannot happen under the current Brexit deal. So does that make the current Brexit deal illegal because it breaks the Good Friday Agreement and there is no grounds in law for actually doing that?
Question for Jane, I guess, first off
Yes.
the bat.
Yes, and thank you for bringing in the Good Friday Agreement, because I talk about it so much. I try to not necessarily focus on it because it is the most important thing, obviously, we have. And first of all, there is a judicial review going on, and some may know better than I, as to whether the protocol breaks both the Act of Union and the Good Friday Agreement. So that is in the courts at the moment, and that will be decided by the courts, and always better that way, I believe, because that is sort of the final word. But the talk about the Good Friday Agreement guarantees north, south, and east, west. This is virtually, if you want to look at it that way, you know, as much equality for north, south as east, west, and internal as well. And the fact that moving the border from the island of Ireland to the Irish Sea looked like it was giving preference to north-south rather than east-west. And that's where the argument is that the principles of the Good Friday Agreement are being, well, we'll see what the court says. So that's what it's all about. It's about the absolute balance between north-south and east-west. And that's why my solution is get away from both, put them in Scotland, England, and use the alternative, use all of the technology in the world to regulate so that the goods can keep flowing, because it's far, far easier between Scotland and England. There was one point Graham made, I'll pick him up on, as he knows I will. He said something could be hugely damaging to Scotland. But surely Brexit is a huger damage to Scotland than this, allowing Scotland to stay half in the EU and half out, but stay in the UK. So I think it would be so much easier to regulate the flow of goods on the Scottish-English border than in the ports in Northern Ireland or on the Irish border.
I think that's an interesting point that will probably be picked up you know, as people look at these proposals in more depth, balancing off the net there of loss of EU trade versus barriers to UK Scottish. I just want to keep the questions flowing from our audience. A question from Sandra Kadori, but who she may have left. Sandra? Okay, I'll read the question out. And perhaps one more for Graham here. It says, I'm wondering how far Scotland can chart its own course, relations with the EU, Nordic Council, Arctic, etc., while still remaining in the UK. Could this autonomous outlook and policies provide the greater sense of independence that Scots want, while still staying in the UK and maintaining vital links with England?
It's an interesting question that Sandra poses, and I know that she has been organising, together with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, a series of meetings trying to keep dialogue going between the UK and the EU on precisely questions like this. I think it ties in very much with the things that have been contributed to the chat by John Moore and by Joe Pye and by Bill and by Morag, you know, partly which ask, well, why should Scotland wait? If I give you my personal perspective on this, I am somebody who's never favoured independence for Scotland, but I've never feared independence for Scotland. I have no doubt that Scotland could survive within the European Union, just as do Denmark or Finland or Slovakia with similar sized populations. Unfortunately, we would be rather closer to Slovakia than we would to Denmark or Finland in economic terms. And yes, it is true, as somebody said in the chat, that the European Union has a history of helping applicant countries to reorient their trade policies and so on. But remember that Scotland's economy is a fairly mature economy, that there is not a great depth of skills in Scotland's workforce, regrettably, something that has been overlooked for many years, that there is not as much investment is needed, and changing that economy will take time. And I think that the argument at the moment between those who say independence now because it's hopeless staying in the United Kingdom and those who are more skeptical is really about what are these economic arguments. First of all, how do you divide the existing situation? There are many in the SNP who would argue that the oil is all Scotland's and the national debt is all England's. Personally, I don't think that's a credible approach. What do you do on the situation of the currency? Scotland, in my view, would have to, well, it would certainly have to commit to adopting the euro legally if it were joining the European Union. What would it do in the meantime? Would it seek some kind of interim currency? And thirdly, what do you do about the problems of the hard border and the economic woes that they would add to? And yes, Brexit has already been damaging, but I bet that a hard border would be at least twice as damaging, if not more so.
Could I come in there? Could I come in there quickly?
Yes, a quick one then, Jane,
Yes.
then we'll switch to another question.
Because I don't think we should think always hard and fast. And you know, for example, the currency. Why not dual currency? It's very interesting that you can have, okay, you've got to peg it to something, of course, but euros fit into our shopping baskets in Tesco's in Northern Ireland. And you can use euros in the phone boxes. You can, you know, why not think out of the box and think of the possible, you know, Scotland having to turn to euros or keep the pound? Think out of the box, dual currency, why not?
Brings me to a question from someone who knows a bit about this, Graham Bishop, but it's not an economic question. Graham, if you're still on the call, do you want to pose your question?
Yes, thanks very much, Nick. Yes, I won't go down the dual currency route. That's a long question. What I really
That's another session with you.
Right. Yes. What I really wanted to ask Jane is, people talk about the Northern Ireland joining the Republic as an escape route from these problems. The question is, would the Republic actually welcome and even allow Northern Ireland to join, given all its problems? Is that a real escape route? Should the Unionists and everyone in Northern Ireland just say, we've got to solve the problem we've got, we can't run away?
Very, very Important question, exactly that, and too rarely asked, I must say. Because the figures, and again, they might not be exact, but I understand that it costs the UK government 10 billion to keep Northern Ireland every year, exactly the same amount of money that it paid into the European Union for membership. So 10 billion. And, and is that what's going to happen to that cost in the event of a united Ireland? Who's going to pay that bill? So that would be the number one thing I would imagine people in the Republic of Ireland would look at. Can we afford Northern Ireland? Not just in terms of what UK puts in to fund everything, but also because of the political reputation and experience we have. And so there's lots of reasons why in a referendum it could easily be a rejection from the South. Who knows? Because it's all about the difference between emotions and politics as well. There's an awful lot of people who are emotionally attached to a united Ireland, but there are an awful lot of people who say, hold on a minute, we got to see. And I suppose it's exactly the same debate that there has been between the pro and anti-Brexit. There's an awful lot of emotion being brought into all of these, and it's so hard to count the cost emotionally, isn't it? So there's the answer to you is really, I don't know whether there'd be it would need at the very least 10 years debate. That's something that we've learned on this island, is that we want to learn the lesson of Brexit, which is we desperately would need a very, very clear understanding of what any shared or united Ireland would look like. The role of the provinces, the role of Stormont, the role and the place for unionism, all of that would have to be as clear before you even entered on setting a date for a referendum. I don't know whether that totally answers your question, because it's more complicated than a dual currency, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. It is this question of whether people in Northern Ireland can run away, as it were, escape the problem. But I think your answer is no, they can't. They just got to face up to, and we and the rest of Britain have got to face that as well.
Yes. I'm going to bring in Hector, who had a question which goes to the impact of what a Scottish independence might have. So Hector, do you want to put your question?
What I'd really like to ask is whether the simple prospect of Scottish independence, or even just simply of a referendum, wouldn't in itself put such pressure on Westminster and public opinion in England generally, that they might seriously consider, as Sir Graham said, throwing out Boris Johnson and considering either the Norway solution or simply coming back to the Union. The Norway solution, we know, is not much of an option, because you become a law taker, not a law maker. But the simple, as I say, I think that the prospects of Scottish independence would put huge pressure on England. Do you think that can happen?
I think, Hector, you may well be right, and we may well see that happening in the coming years. But to me, one of the most significant developments of the past 12 or 24 months has been the change in opinion, at least according to opinion polls, within the Conservative Party, perhaps to some extent even more widely across the electorate in England, but particularly within the Conservative Party, about the prospect of Northern Ireland reuniting with the South, or the prospect of Scotland becoming independent. And I think that there has been a fundamental change. A party which was the Conservative and Unionist Party has now become the English National Party. And that is driving the debate in Scotland as much as anything else.
We got a question. Is this Bill? There's a question on the statistics about trade.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was simply wanting to go in the the statistics you're quoting, Sir Graham, about cross-border traffic, they are top-line statistics, and I certainly appreciate that the data that you've got available is quite limited. Within that, you've certainly identified the 10 billion whisky, and a lot of that's destined for the Port of London, I would imagine, for onward dispatch around the world. But is a part of this, does this not really need some sort of logistical study about the nature of the consignments? If it's single bulk consignments, for example, I don't think these statistics are readily available. But if it's a single bulk consignment, the logistics of controlling cross-border traffic on that would be a lot easier. In other words, the headline figure of 80 billion is perhaps misleading.
Yes, in answer to the question, I mean, the statistics are limited. And there is an argument which says, well, how much of what goes from Scotland across the border to England ends up going to the rest of the world as final destinations? Look, 10 billion is food and drink, and there is no doubt that that gets traded around the world, and some of it exported directly from Scotland to elsewhere, much of it, as I said, via Amsterdam. If you look at, via Rotterdam. If you look at Scotland's export markets, you're talking about something like 60% at least of all trade being across the border to the rest of the United Kingdom. And probably, but because we don't have the figures for the trade in services, probably substantially more than that. But if you look at what's happening in our ports, exports to China are going up rapidly, exports to Korea are going up rapidly, exports to India, some of it will be food and drink. We can always do with better statistics. What I think remains clear is that Scotland could do much better as an exporting nation than it does. We export less of our product than many similar nations. And in fact, the Scottish government, to give them credit where credit's due, actually recognise this and are working very hard to try to increase the percentage of what we produce that's exported.
Thank you for that. I realise that time is moving on, and I'm sorry that I haven't been able to bring in everyone's questions. There was one from Fraser Cameron, if you're still on the call, and I think this could be answered by both Graham and Jane, because it sounds as if what's coming through the arguments on all sides is that this a fundamental trade-off or a fundamental split between questions of identity and questions of economics. But Fraser, maybe you want to put it in your own words.
No, you put it exactly as I would have framed it. How does Graham and Jane see the balance going forward of the debate amongst the political parties between the economic trade side, pro-union, and the identity issues, which I assume Sinn Féin and Northern Ireland and the SNP in Scotland will produce? How do they see that balance going forward?
Thank you. Jane, do you want to lead off on that?
Okay. I think it's obviously I called it the emotional side, but the identity side is a huge part of that. And I do feel that somewhere at the bottom of our hearts, it's identity. In fact, I'll get a chance to come in here, actually. For example, and I'll take the example of Riverdance, right? Riverdance, this wonderful Irish musical that went around the world and increased Ireland's clout in the world, thanks to this wonderful musical masterpiece. There's another one called On Eagle's Wing, which is about Ulster Scots. And the fact that the Ulster Scots apparently were most of the presidents of the United States rather than Irish, maybe I'm exaggerating a little, but there's all of that cultural tradition. You know, Ulster Scots doesn't get a look in when it comes to America, but yet President Clinton said of the 40 million Irish Americans, half are Protestant, but yet we never hear about the Ulster Scots tradition, the Ulster Scots identity. All of that should be given much, much more backing, if you like, support in America, in Europe. You know, it shouldn't always just be the Irish identity. It should be Ulster Scots as well. So both together. And there, I'm taking a long time home, and I'll give time to Graham to reply to that one. Thanks.
Well, to supplement what Jane has said, I think this question of identity versus trade is an interesting and important one, and I fear that political parties possibly put too much emphasis on the emotion and not enough on the reason. But, you know, this is what politics is about, because in any decision like this, while economic interests will set the stage, it is always human emotions that determine the script. And we are, every one of us, vulnerable to these. I'm somebody who was born on a small island off the west coast of Scotland, but who grew up largely elsewhere, dragged from pillar to post around what remained of the empire, and then finally dumped in the south of England in an Admiralty town. You know, I carried two buckets, and carrying two buckets was easier than one, and I kind of grew up in between. I understand the emotional pull of independence, particularly when people feel that we have a government which cares not two hoots about what happens in Scotland. That seems to be the case. But I think we would be very unwise not to look very closely at the economic arguments. And I think the onus is on those who seek independence to make economic arguments that convince others. Andrew Wilson has done a lot of work in this area, a lot of good work, but there's a lot more remains to be done.
Thank you, Graham. I'm going to pass on to Sharon now to conclude and give a vote of thanks. So Sharon, the floor is yours. On my personal thanks both to Sir Graham and Jane. Now over to Sharon.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nick, for running this. Thank you, Graham and Jane, for your great thoughts, as always. And I just really wanted to round up with a few words about Pro-Europa. But before doing that, I'm going to draw attention to a remark in the chat by Jeremy, by Jez, because I think that this question of identity, multiple identity and multiple governance structures lies at the heart of finding a solution. And in a way, maybe the UK needs to go through a little bit of disintegration to understand the value of being part of, just within the UK, a single market and a customs union, and why that makes sense. And then ultimately as part of the European single market and customs union. And it's a kind of whole learning process, maybe. And also what I take away very much from the discussion is the importance of the Westminster bubble and the Brussels bubble gaining better understanding and respect, above all, respect for the multiple groups and interests and views out among the peoples of Europe. So there are lots of lessons that are coming from this process. Anyway, for Pro-Europa, I just wanted to say that we're now very much involved in the pro-European movement in the UK. We're a little bit of a Brussels arm for that. We're part of a round table which brings together the European movement, Best for Britain, New Europeans, the 3 million British in Europe. There's a whole range, the Welsh and the Scottish and the Northern Irish groups. And what we really want to do is to encourage our Brussels, our EU expert members to get back involved. Expertise is going to be part of helping up the debate in the UK, and to help the pro-European movement in the UK to understand better some of the things that are going on here and how things work. It all helps. And I want to encourage you to email us if you'd like to get more involved. We're doing a lot of different things, from organizing events like this. We'd like to help you with we can help you with getting articles published in the UK. There's a whole network of citizen journalism. We can help with getting speaking slots if you're prepared to speak. just simply, we would really welcome help with organising, with discussing, with furthering the discussion, and ultimately we may start campaigning again. But in the meantime, we are definitely helping our fellow groups in the UK to move up and onwards as well. And so I would really like to encourage you to write to the email address if you're interested in getting back involved, and keep in touch. We've got groups. We're looking at creative communications. We have discussion groups, and we would just encourage you to get back actively involved. Also, one final little thank you to the person behind the screen and behind this is Joe, who's been running the technical side of this, and to John, who has been producing videos and creative media. That's what we want to focus on now.
And I just say thank you for giving my idea airtime, and I'm very, very grateful, and let's keep working at everything we can to get the UK back in, and if not, skinny on the cards as the Benelux. Thank you very much.
Thank you.